All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so glad that you're here. It's 2 o'clock and we have a lot to go through today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Anna Mars, and I am a part of the team that supports all of our COR Advantage users. And I am so excited to be here today, and I am even more excited to be joined by my colleague, Holly Delgado, who is an early childhood specialist at HighScope.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, definitely. Like Anna said, thanks again for joining us for those of you that have been with us through the series, and then today specifically for this webinar. We're excited to share some information with you.
Absolutely. And so our topic today is assessment tips for teachers, strategies for partnering with families to collect data. So we're super excited to jump into this today. Today, we're going to be focusing on 4 main topics. Our first topic that we're going to cover is really thinking back to 2019, 2020, even though that might feel like it was a lifetime ago, but thinking about the data that we already collected and the ways that we can use that to inform our 2020, 2021 year and help us get off to a strong start there. After that, we're going to talk about ways to intentionally plan for virtual and remote activities with assessment in mind. So how are we, if we are doing virtual and remote activities, how are we making sure that we're, really thinking intentionally as we plan for those so that it can help us get the information we need to continue to work with our children. Next, we're going to talk about intentional questions and thinking about in our conversations with families, how can we be thoughtful and intentional in the questions that we're asking to, again, help give us that information that we need. And then last, we're gonna take a look at some of the technical aspects within COR Advantage that can help us with that throughout the year. At the end, we're going to transition to an open Q&A. We promise that we will be saving time for that. So please, if you have questions as we're going along, please go ahead and write those into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So as you can tell, we're going to be covering a lot of information today. Please keep in mind, though, that you do not need to remember it all. We will be recording this webinar, and it will be available to everyone after the fact, so you'll always be able to come back and reference it. In addition to that, your certificate will come out 24 hours after the conclusion of this event. We'll remind you about that again later, but just wanted to name that as well. A couple of housekeeping tips again. So during the webinar, as I mentioned, questions, go ahead and use that Q&A section. We do have a team that will be helping to answer them throughout the webinar. And like I said, we will be saving time afterwards at the end of our session. If you have additional questions today that come up afterwards, or if your question does not get answered, please reach out to us at help@coradvantage.com, and we're happy to do that and happy to help you. There's a lot of folks here today, which is really exciting, but it might mean that we're not able to get to all of the questions. So if we do not get to yours, please go ahead and reach out to us afterwards. So with that, we really want to start off by learning a little bit more about what brought you here today. And so we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. And so I'm going to do that now, and you should see 2 questions in your poll. One is asking you about what your biggest concerns are about child assessment in the 2020 year. So thinking about, are some of your concerns around collecting data, the ability to do it, or the ability to get good data. So that's our first question for you. And the second question is really, we want to hear from you about what you're most hoping to learn today, and sort of what brought you here. So I'm seeing this come in pretty quickly. This is awesome. We will leave this going for about 10 more seconds or so. Awesome. Just about 3 more seconds, and then I'm going to go ahead and stop this. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the poll results. So this is great. I think, pretty even split on the first one, but I think one of the things that's definitely coming up is, the ability to collect useful data. And I think that's so important because we know that, we want to be collecting this data so it can be informing our instruction. So we'll definitely be talking about that. In addition to that, in terms of what we're all hoping to learn today, I think tips for collecting data virtually, which is great. And we're definitely going to get into that. We have some examples to show you, both in terms of, the content and ways that you can think through that, as well as how you can use the system, the COR Advantage system, to help with that. So thank you so much again for being here. We're really excited to jump in. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Holly, to start our conversation today.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. So as we are looking at that poll, right, it's obvious that we have a lot of concerns regarding data and the assessment process this upcoming school year as a result of COVID-19. So one of the things that we can do is we can use our data from the 2019-2020 school year to really help us frame this upcoming school year. Specifically, we might be able to use this information to help us think about where our children might be developmentally, even if we don't have immediate live face-to-face physical contact with them right now. So one of the things we all know that child assessment data is really instrumental to the work that we do within early childhood. So on a regular basis, even before COVID, right, we were gathering evidence as it aligns to COR Advantage, and then we used that information to really drive the instruction in our classrooms. We used observations to help us consider what our children's interests were, and it told us specifically what our children liked to do, what materials perhaps they chose to engage with. And if we collected high quality evidence, it actually told us where our children were functioning developmentally. We were able to score those anecdotes, those photos, and those videos by aligning them to our COR Advantage levels. Right now, however, many of us are virtual and we are engaged in remote learning, or we're in a hybrid setting and we may only see children for really kind of limited amounts of time. So if you happen to live in an area where you actually were lucky enough to reopen fully, you still have all of the safety protocols in place that may prevent, or you still have lots of safety protocols that are in place that might actually prevent you from collecting data in the same ways that you have done in the past. Additionally, we don't necessarily know where all of our children are right now, right? We don't know what types of learning took place while our children and our families were in quarantine. What happened between March and September? Did our shift to that kind of virtual learning format in the spring, when essentially we were doing what I like to refer to as crisis schooling, right? We had this quick upheaval and an upending of our lives. So did our work back then actually do what we had intentionally set out to do? Did we reach children and families and continue children on that same learning trajectory that they were on when they left us? We don't know the answers to these questions. We might be able to hypothesize, but chances are we don't necessarily have any strong data from those few months to really back those opinions. So our data right now is going to be as important as ever. And we can use last year's data as a springboard to really begin thinking about this year. One way that we can do that is to think about where children were in March when they left us. So that gives us an opportunity to really kind of think about the development of specific children, and specifically those children that are returning back to our programs. So these would be the children who might be returning for another year. They might have been 3, perhaps, when we were forced into quarantine, and they turned 4 over the course of the spring or the summer and are 4 now. Or they may have been a child who moved from one of our toddler programs into a preschool program. Whoever they are and kind of however they moved between classrooms within our programs, last year's COR Advantage evidence could be really instrumental in helping us understand where they might be developmentally when they enter back into our programs this fall. Another way that we can use that previous year's data is to really think about it as baseline. So it can help us kind of frame where our children are typically in regards to the developmental domains and assessment items on COR Advantage, even as that new group is entering. So that return to kind of what we might think about as like quote unquote typical, right? Gives us a starting place for the learning that will happen this year. This will be especially important for those programs who do not have physical contact with children as the year begins, because it'll be really hard to assess where children are at. Because it'll be really hard to assess where children are at when we're not really directly interacting with them for extended periods of time. So instead of relying on gathering baseline data really early this school year, we could use last year's period 1 data as kind of that baseline guidance for designing lessons this fall. There we go. So what we are looking at right now is one of our COR Advantage growth and planning reports. This is the progress overview report. In this report specifically, we chose a single student. So the values on this report represent the highest scores that were observed for that student during an assessment period. And because we left the school year last year in the middle of our 3rd period, we ended our school year with some data in period 2, or some data in period 3, and a lot of data still in period 2, because we finished out and had closed period 2 and then didn't quite get through period 3. We can use this to really help us frame our thinking around where a particular child was when they left us. So pre-quarantine, we can use this report to help give us that information. In the case of a returning child, we can pull this report to look back at all of those scores from period 2 and period 3 to help us build those lesson plans and our scaffolding strategies that we're going to start with this school year. Because learning happens on a continuum, it may be just as important to read the indicators for the level just above or even perhaps just below that highest score to really guide our lesson planning process and think about how we can individualize our teaching and our learning process for that particular child. Similarly, we can pull a progress overview report for our entire classroom. This will give us the picture of a typical classroom performance in the fall. So in this case, we want us to pull our data, the entire classroom again, and specifically we're going to look at period 1. This is going to give us that typical baseline from which we can begin our lesson planning. Again, kind of knowing that COVID-19 may have adversely affected some of our children, we will definitely want to use this as a guide and only a guide to really start our school year. It'll help us develop those kind of first few lesson plans, those first few interactions that we have with children, because we know that in addition to not having school, our children have also had no access to community centers, no access to parks, no access to libraries. So we might also, just like we mentioned earlier with the one child, we may also want to look at the level perhaps right below these scores to design some scaffolding strategies that are going to best fit our children. But beyond those initial lesson plans, and as you receive kind of more and more new data on your current children, you'll want to make a shift from last year's data to this year's data. So you'll definitely want to figure out when makes the most sense, when do I have enough data in my system, or even just perhaps those informal interactions to make that shift from last year to now, this is what I already know about this year's students. If you happen to be unable to access this information for some reason, or if you just decide, you know what, I'm just one classroom, but we have a larger program, and so we could look at a larger sample size, you could ask your administrator to run this progress report for all of the classrooms on the same age group within your program or your organization. So for example, you could look at all preschool classrooms, You could look at all 3-year-old classrooms, perhaps it's all young toddler rooms, and so on. So definitely make sure that you are also reaching out to your program administrators as you're thinking about pulling these reports. All right. We also need to think a little bit about planning for virtual and remote learning. So in addition to data, we want to consider our roles. In many ways this year, we actually are shifting from teaching children to really supporting and coaching parents. And this is new for all of us. So we're really going to want to make sure that we are intentionally planning for our remote and our virtual learning sessions. So let's talk about some of those considerations for this upcoming school year. First, you want to make sure that you are considering your daily routine. As we make a shift from teaching children to coaching parents, and from kind of a face-to-face to a virtual model, you'll want to consider what parts of the daily routine best lend themselves to that live virtual teaching, and which parts might be pre-recorded, shared with families in a video format, or perhaps even switched to a newsletter or a blog or some other sort of written format. You'll want to consider what times of day might remain teacher facilitated and what times of day we as teachers would instead really kind of model and coach our family members to take the lead on. So those adult facilitated times of day should still remain adult facilitated, but it might not be us as the classroom teachers who are actually leading those activities. In order to do this effectively and to receive feedback from family members that can be loaded into COR Advantage, we need our families to really understand our daily routine, as well as our assessment process. So remembering that they might not have a background in education or child development, it's going to be really important for us to explain our curriculum and our assessment in really easily understood terms that include very actionable requests. For example, we might explain the importance of the plan, do, review sequence by saying something like, one of our goals is to help children become more intentional in their play. We want them to be able to enter play with a purpose. And to do this, we would plan with children before they start engaging with their toys. We might ask them questions about what materials they might choose to use, or what other toys or things that they might need while they are playing. We might encourage them to think about the steps or the sequence that might happen in their play. So for example, we might say something like, oh, you want to play with your dolls. What do you think could happen as you are playing? And if children are unable to come up with answers on their own, we might prompt them by asking some questions like, well, we just woke up. I wonder if your doll is hungry, or do you think your doll might need to take a bath like you did this morning? So asking kind of these more focused questions while we're still leaving room for children to choose and create their own plans are going to help children enter play in a more purposeful way. Try it out. Send me a message on COR at Home that illustrates your discussion and follow it up with what your child did as they started to play. So those are examples of things that we might say, right? We could do that in a video format. So I just said it to you here on the screen, but we can do that in a video format. We are definitely walking kind of a fine line this year as we try to give parents enough information so that they can successfully implement our curriculum and build their own knowledge of child development. But on the flip side, we actually don't want to provide too much or make our ask too stressful, so we don't overwhelm parents who might already be in kind of this state of anxiety as a result of all of the impacts of COVID-19. We could also consider how we might ask parents to complete an activity that intentionally plans for multiple COR Advantage items. It's absolutely acceptable, and in fact, it's way less work on our part and the part on our parents if we're able to do some of that cross-referencing. So we want to think about how children might observe and classify items in nature, right? So that gives us 2 different COR Advantage items right within science and technology. Or we might ask a family to take a video of their child making a plan and then play that plan back to them while they're doing some recall and talking about what it is that happened. So this will give us information both in initiative and planning and in reflection. Fine motor could be incorporated into writing and art activities. Building relationships with peers might happen alongside gross motor if children are out playing at parks or outside in the backyard with siblings. Really intentionally planning for that cross-referencing to occur will make our assessment process that much easier on our part as well as on the part of our families. Also, as you're considering your daily routine, you will want to think about what you can assess virtually and what might be more difficult for you to see via a video conference. You might be able to see some gross motor development as you're facilitating a large group time in a live virtual setting, but personal care and healthy behaviors is going to sit much more squarely as a family observed activity. So determining which core advantage items you think will be harder to assess and plan for those early in your data period. That way, if you're not able to capture an anecdote or a piece of evidence that really aligns with the core advantage levels initially, you'll have an opportunity to try that again. The data that does come in will help us in determining where the child is at developmentally and what they might be interested in so that we can plan a follow-up activity with a more narrow focus in order to capture that data perhaps a second or a third time around. We're actually going to watch a video right now that demonstrates our preschool teacher, Jenny, asking families to complete one of our Numbers Plus activities. The Numbers Plus activity is called How Fast Does Your Car Go? And as you're watching, I really want you to look at some of the specific strategies that Jenny is using to guide family members in thinking about core advantage item CC, which is predicting, experimenting, and drawing conclusions.
Hello families, welcome to today's activity, Racing at the Preschool Raceway. For this activity, you'll need the small toy car that was included in your materials activity kit for the week, and also something to make a ramp to roll your car down and something to prop that ramp up. I'm using a long piece of cardboard and a shoebox. You could also use things like plastic tote lids, cookie sheets, large books, paper tubes, clipboards, anything that's large enough to roll a car down. So in this activity, we're going to be scientists by making predictions and experimenting to test our ideas out. Every experiment starts with a question, and our question is today, what do you predict will happen when we put this car at the top of the ramp? And remember, prediction is when you say something that you think will happen. Let's make our predictions. I predict that when I put my car at the top of the ramp, it's gonna roll down. Maybe fast, I don't know. Let's test out that idea by experimenting. All right, are you ready for the first experiment? Let's see what happens. Whoa, what happened? It rolled down the ramp, it did. It didn't go really fast though. It kind of went medium speed, not fast, but not slow. What do you think made it go that speed? It looks like part of my prediction was correct. I predicted that if I put it on the top of the ramp, that it would roll down, but I thought it was gonna go fast, but it kind of just went medium. That leads us to our next question. How do you think we can make it go even faster? I remember a while back seeing balls rolling down the slide at the playground. And when we put the balls towards the bottom of the slide where it wasn't very high, the balls didn't roll fast. But I remember when we put the balls up high at the top of the slide, they rolled really fast. Just now, my ramp isn't that high, so it didn't go very fast. I'm predicting that maybe if we move this end of the ramp up higher and taller like the tall slide, I'm predicting that it might make my car go faster. Let's experiment and test it out. All right, guys, so I raised up the incline of our ramp, so now it's more steep, like the slide. So let's test it out. Remember, we predicted that it would go faster. Let's see what happens. Are you ready? Whoa, did you see that? Oh my goodness. It did go faster. Our prediction was correct. The taller the ramp and the higher the slope, the faster it went. So now I wonder what your next predictions will be and what different kinds of ramps you might build. Show us and tell us about your raceways. What kinds of predictions did you make? And what happened when you experimented? Was it what you expected, or did something different happen? And why do you think it happened that way? So while you're racing cars at home with your preschooler, you can comment on how they're using the materials, how they're making the ramps, and what they're doing with them. You can ask them to describe what's happening and also to explain their thinking by asking them questions like, why do you think that happened that way? When you try out this activity with your preschooler, you can extend it by trying out different kinds of materials of different lengths and sizes to use as a ramp. You can experiment with different heights to use as inclines for the ramp. Also, try starting your race out in different spots on the ramp, from the top to the bottom, and see how it happens differently. If you have extra things to roll down the ramp like balls, extra cars, toilet paper tubes, maybe roll them side by side and have a race. You can also use measuring tapes and rulers to mark and measure distance. You could also use a stopwatch or the timer on your cell phone to measure the length of time that the material rolls. To send us your results, you can send us notes, pictures, and videos via email, and also send us your results through the COR Advantage Family Portal. We can't wait to hear from you. Until next time, bye.
All right. Yeah, I love this video for a lot of different reasons. Jenny, of course, is very just authentic and natural and engaging with children, lots of voice inflection and engagement. But she also really draws out the vocabulary words. So words like prediction and experiment and incline and steep and slope, these are all words that she would want our families to use when they were engaging with their own children. And then she goes back and she follows up on her initial prediction. She draws conclusions as a result of the experiment. She poses some open-ended questions such as, I wonder what made it go that speed, or how could we make it go even faster? She connected this new learning with prior knowledge and made a very specific ask of family members. And then she ended her video with some strategies that parents can use as they are engaging with their children. She made the experience accessible to all by offering lots of different material suggestions and encouraging some really open-ended methods of experimentation. What we're going to watch right now is a response from one of our family members to this preschool raceway.
Tell me about your cars that you wanted to use.
I want this car, this car, this car, this car, and this car.
And which one do you think is going to be the fastest car?
This one, this one, this one, this one, this one.
In that order? Okay. Drill?
Yeah.
Did he go faster or slower?
Faster.
Whoa. That one pretty fast.
Yeah, he's slower.
Wow. And they all made it down. How about this one? Yeah.
Ready, booster style. Yeah.
Whoa. So.
All right. So you can see there, just from watching this one video, right? This one video response, we can see that this little guy is making predictions at random. He's pointing to his cars when his dad asked him what was going to happen and which one would be faster. He actually used a few measurement terms in there. So he said fast, although we did hear him use the word faster, it was hard to tell based on this evidence alone if it was really a comparison or him just repeating what his dad was saying. But he also threw in some of his own kind of quote unquote measurement terms, right? He talked about things like speed. He said super boost speed. which lets us know that he's really kind of having fun with this activity. He's able to be creative, and he's able to insert some of his own child language and thoughts. And following up with this family, once this video was submitted via COR at Home, and some one-on-one kind of scheduled meetings later in the week, we can point these things out. We can prompt dad's knowledge of child development by saying he's already making some verbal predictions about which cars he thinks are going to go faster, but right now it's kind of random. He pointed to all of his cars. To dig deeper, something you could do with him is get him to really think about his prediction by saying, tell me why you thought that white car might be the fastest. So being able to kind of dig a little deeper with him, and we can share some of those strategies with dad. We can also talk about, or we did talk about, this super fancy kind of constructed ramp, right? So from this video, it looks like this is something that this little guy actually has regular access to. But in conversation, we realized that they actually had started off just with a 2x4 that was in their garage, and cars were falling off of it right at the top. They weren't going straight, they weren't held straight and going straight down. So they were starting to fall off of it well before they reached the bottom. So through conversation with family, outside of just this video, we actually realized that there was a lot of other problem solving that was going on in regards to this activity that we didn't even see. So we could discuss with the dad the child's role in that and how dad might be able to engage him in some more problem solving. He could make sure that he's giving Andreo, in this case, some time to have some additional wait time right before he's answering or before dad actually jumps in with a solution to the problem himself. We can also talk about siblings who are part of this family, could engage with them during an activity like this because they could also do some modeling for him. As a result, right, of their responses, we now know some ways that we can really kind of individualize for this family. It seems like because they've created this ramp, they did some problem solving around it, that this is a family that is going to engage with us in some hands-on problem solving ways, and different experiments might be things that we might want to follow up on. So we could give them different types of activities that are more individualized but similar in nature to this one. I'm now actually going to turn it back over to Anna, who's going to talk about some different strategies that we might use as we're engaging families in this data collection process.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Holly. I love that video for so many reasons. I think it gives so much insight into what's happening at home. And I saw in the chat, people were talking about, what a great conversation that this child was having with his father, right? And hearing and seeing that dialogue gives so much information to the teacher, which is awesome. And as you unpacked for us, I mean, there's a lot that we're able to learn, both from that specific piece of evidence that we received back, but also from the follow-up conversation. So in addition to the video, right, we were able to learn about the problem solving and all of that came through the conversation. So let's shift to that and let's think about, how can we be intentional in our conversations with our families to gain even more insight into children's learning and development. So first and foremost, like Holly's mentioned, and I want to name again, you are in the position where you really know your families best. And just like we individualize for our children, we really need to be intentional in how we're individualizing for our data collection methods for our families. And so like Holly mentioned, we learned something from that last interaction about, what types of activities might engage that family to kind of get some of that information back. We can now use that to inform the future activities that we're sending to that family in particular. Now, I think, we showed an example of getting a video back. That's going to work for some families. That's not going to work for every family. And that's okay. And as educators, we need to be conscious of that. And we need to be able to, to understand our families so that we're being sure we're not placing that undue burden on them. So while asking families to kind of help, provide some documentation or share back things through video is great, it is not the only way that we can gather information. You can always ask families to send back photos. You can ask families to send notes. I've heard great stories about teachers who were became pen pals with their students and were mailing things out and getting things mailed back. And of course, there's always the ability to just pick up the phone and call. So we're going to look at a few examples for some of these additional types of communication. And again, I think one thing that you're going to see that kind of consistently comes through these examples is that layer of intentionality and really using your core advantage items, your core advantage indicators to begin planning for your activities, to begin planning for your conversations, so that they are really intentional and they are really giving you the information that you need. So I think with all pieces of documentation that you're sending out, one thing that's going to be particularly important is really making a specific ask. So we heard that from Jenny in the last video that we watched, where we saw, her asking specifically back for, information about how this went when they tried it out, when families tried it out with their child at home. And so that's going to be really important there. In addition to that, there are a lot of ways that we can make a specific ask. So we're going to show another example of a teacher communicating out with families, and again, what that specific ask looked like. So we're going to go ahead and show that video now. The sound on this one is a little bit soft, so if you need to turn up the volume, you can go ahead and do that now.
Boys and girls, today I'm going to share a photo of my family. Let's take a look at my family today. Oh, this is me sitting down in the brown coat. This is my oldest daughter, Julia, in the blue sweater. This is my youngest daughter, Ashley, in the purple sweater. And this is my middle daughter, Melissa, with the scarf. There's 4 people in my family. I was wondering, how many people are in your family? The other day, we dropped off some markers, crayons, paper. We dropped off some big pieces of paper, some medium pieces of paper, and some small pieces of paper. And I was wondering, how are you going to draw your family? You can choose to use the big paper, the medium-sized paper, all the small pieces of paper, and write their names on the paper so we can get to know your family. So send us your drawing through the family portal. I can't wait to see the drawings of your family. Have a great day.
So I love this. This is another example of a teacher pre-recording something and sharing it out and sending it out through the system. But you can very easily envision how this type of an activity could be translated to a different form of communication, right? This is something that the teacher could have translated to a live virtual meeting that they had with families. It's something that you could envision happening over the phone. This is a conversation that the teacher could have with a family, still with the same specific ask. You could also envision this being something that, if you were using mail, that this is something you're writing about and sending a letter and asking for families to send something back to you. If you're sending, for example, a stamped envelope or something with the letter that you're sending out. So you can absolutely envision that. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the specific, what the response was that the teacher got back from one of their children. So you can see that here. You can see that they got 2 photos in response. One was of the child doing the activity, and another was of the finished product. And so again, this is another example where you're able to see more than one developmental area coming through here, right? Of course, we're able to see those fine motor skills when we look at how the child is completing the activity. The family has really helped by being our eyes so that we're able to now see exactly how this child is gripping that marker. And that gives us insight into that. In addition, this is an opportunity to understand where the child is at on creative arts, and understand what we're seeing with that when we see that finished drawing here. So again, this was one activity. It was a 1-minute video that was sent out, and this was what came back. And this is giving some really helpful insights to family or to teachers, and to this teacher in particular, to make sure that they have this information. So again, I think I encourage you, to think about an activity like this as well when you're starting your year, because this is also a way to really think about how you're building your partnerships with families. This is not only a great activity to give you insights about, where the child is at in certain developmental areas, but to help you get to know your children and get to know your families, which are something that are going to be particularly important at the beginning of the year as you're beginning to build those partnerships. We will be hosting an additional webinar next week, which will provide more information about, which will provide additional insights and ways that you can be thinking about building partnerships with families. But I did just want to highlight that this is one specific way that you are able to do that. So again, I think what I really encourage you to do is just to think about, how you're being very intentional in the way that you are doing and the way that you're planning out these activities. So with that, we're going to kind of jump in to a few other points to consider. So those were some examples of families sending documentation back, but we want to talk a little bit more about conversations and how we can use conversations to get some of those insights. We know that not all families are going to be able to send something back, whether it's via mail or electronically through the system. And so I think really thinking about the power of conversations and how we're having informative and intentional conversations is going to be important. So when you start your conversations with families, we really encourage you to use open-ended questions so that you're starting off your conversations by creating a space that feels authentic and allows families to share those authentic experiences with you. So instead of saying something like, how high can your child count? Starting off the conversation where you're asking the families to tell you stories and asking, for example, can you tell me about a time that your child showed you that they were counting? Was it when you were unpacking groceries or you were folding socks? Can you tell me about a time like that? And what did your child count? And so starting a conversation like that is going to open a dialogue where families can share their experience in an authentic way. And then you can always follow that up with specific follow-up questions to kind of get the additional information that you need as you're trying to understand where specifically the specific indicator that might describe the child's behavior as you're hearing it from families. So asking things like, how did they count? How did they keep track of what they were counting? Things like that can be specific follow-up questions that you follow up with. And then in addition, we heard Jenny doing this in the video, but just always want to remind you as well that any of those conversations with families, whether they are happening, through video, through a live virtual event or over the phone, are always great opportunities to provide simple conversational scaffolding opportunities. So like Holly was saying at the beginning, as we were framing this, so much of our role this year is going to be on coaching our families and coaching our parents. And the best ways that we can do that are to offer, those really simple scaffolding strategies. So if you've had a conversation with a family about counting, providing a tip, for example, about, what you do with the children in class. For example, we pick up an object and we move it somewhere else so that they understand a counting strategy that you use. So really thinking about those opportunities to not only get information from families, but to offer gentle strategies to them as well. And I think we heard We heard Holly giving another example of this earlier, but one thing that's going to be so important is making sure that the language that we're using with families is clear and specific, so that we're offering you know, a specific strategy that they can try the next time that really brings them into the conversation and helps them understand the simple ways that, you know, through their everyday experiences that they're having with their children, they are supporting their children's learning. So just a few tips on those as well. We do want to shift to talking a little bit as well about the COR Advantage system and different features of the system that can help you with this from a technical standpoint. So I'm going to shift us over to the system now so that we can take a look at that. And we're going to take a look at, you know, what it would look like to send something out of the system, but then also how we can be receiving that information back from families. So I'm live in my, my sample COR Advantage account. I'm on my moments page here, which is going to be a great place where you can see all of that documentation that's coming in from families. Of course, we can always send something out of the system. So when you do that and you're sending that out to families, using this new observation button, even if it's a video of yourself, is where you're going to start. So this new observation button right here is going to be a place where you could upload a video if you have one. So for example, this video we saw of this teacher here, I can very easily add a caption if I want to. Maybe in this case, I'm going to call it family, and I'm going to add a note that again reiterates what my specific ask is. You know, something, a note of encouragement, I can say, you know, I can't wait to see who's in your family. I can save that. And then when I go to add my students by clicking on this pencil button, one tip that I can do is I can go ahead and just click classroom, and it will select all of the children in my classroom. I can set that up, I can save that. And then what you can see in the top is I then have the ability to share this out. So I can click that send now button if I want to send that out, or the send in digest if I want to send it later. So when I click that send now button, it will send out to all of my families and they'll get this video from me. So again, that's one way that you can be sending out some of this pre-recorded content to families. I do also want to talk about ways that you can get information back from families. So as we've been talking about, you know, there are ways for families to send photos or videos back into the system. One new way that we have to do that is through our new family app. So this is called Kambu for Families. And through this can be a streamlined place where families can see all of the documentation that's coming out to them, but also a place where they can respond directly back. So I'm just going to show you what this looks like briefly. We do have a whole webinar on this. So if you're looking for more information on this, we have tons of support articles on help.coradvantage.com and about the family app in particular. So this is what it's going to look like. I'm in kind of my main feed right here as a parent. And I'm seeing all of the messages that have come out, and I can scroll through and I can see all of those here. In addition to that, if I did want to take a photo or take a video and send that back, the at home module is now fully integrated into this. So that green plus button for families is where they can click on that. And then they'll have the ability to go ahead and add documentation. So this will bring up a screen where they are able to add a photo, add a video into the system, add a note, and send that back. And so like I said, we have a full webinar on this that we encourage you to take a look at if you are looking for more information on this, but this will allow that to send back into the system. Once families do send using that module, that's going to come into the moments page again. And that's always going to automatically be tagged with something called the family submitted tag, which you'll now see in your tags in your account. And so this will be a great way to understand what the source of this data is. So if you're looking for a particular piece of documentation, you can always filter based on family submitted, based on the child's name, and see that come up, and you can filter in that way. But you can also manually add this tag to anything that you're adding into the conversation, or that you're adding into the system. So if you've had a conversation with families and you're going ahead and you're typing up an anecdote based on that conversation, one thing that you'll notice is that you can always choose to include that family submitted tag as well. So again, more resources on that, specifically on the help.coradvantage.com, and you can find more information about the family app and how it works specifically. We've also included in those resources on the help page information about how you can share this out with families that walks them through the process of setting that up. So they're always able to do that as well. So again, just to encourage you to kind of think about different ways that you can be collecting that information. If you have received documentation from families in a different way, maybe they emailed you something, you can still always upload that directly into the system. And like I said, you can still add that family submitted tag. So you're always able to do that. One last thing that I did want to remind everyone as well is just another suggestion that we have is to think about, when you're receiving that documentation from families, to make sure you're responding. You can respond directly from the system, saying thank you, acknowledging what they've done, and asking those follow-up questions so that you can get that additional information about what's happening and kind of get more of that context as we've been talking about. So those are our main strategies that we wanted to share today. I do want to go ahead and open it up for a Q&A at this point. And so Holly, have you seen a good first question that has come in?
Yeah, I have. We have actually lots of great questions that are coming in. So go ahead and drop those into the Q&A if you haven't done that already. One question that came in from someone is, how might you explain the reasoning behind why we want kids to be intentional while playing? So we talked a little bit about that. We want to make sure, as we're talking to parents, right, that we're bringing that down to a level that our parents are able to understand. But we really want to think about when children are planning, they're going to enter their play more purposefully. And over time, when they're entering play that way, it's going to become more complex. That's how they're starting to build some of their executive functioning skills, which we think about, right, as that higher level thinking skills. So working memory, they're able to perhaps manage their frustrations a little bit differently because they've entered with a very specific purpose. It helps them build focus and really sustain attention. Also gives them some abilities to practice with some mental flexibility, so some creative thinking as they're moving through. So definitely we want to make sure that we are explaining to parents why we want them to plan, and really breaking down. I think that's going to be key as we move virtually, is really thinking about the whys behind everything that we do in our classroom and helping parents understand play-based learning a little bit more. So that's the answer to that question.
Totally. I love that. And I love, in addition to that, the way that you just explained that, using really accessible language, right? Like using it in a way that, that families can grasp. And I think that is going to be so important throughout, is making sure we're breaking down those concepts for families so that it's super clear to them. In addition to that, another question that came in was just about, we're told we can't give out supplies. And I think I saw another question coming in about, how supplies are getting out. And so how do we understand what materials families have at home? And so I think, one thing that I love about the video that we saw with Jenny is the number of different suggestions she gave. And I think thinking about, all of the different possible suggestions and sort of doing that pre-work and pre-thinking for your families so that you're providing them with tons of different suggestions that really cut across material type, cut across why or where they might have that, but then continuing to let families know that, building a ramp they don't need to have, it was great that in that video we saw that board, but they don't need to have the board, right? And if they don't have any of the materials that you suggested, that they can continue to be creative. In addition to that, in terms of getting materials out, we've heard about programs that have done it in different ways, either by dropping things off or by having them, connected to meal pickups. So if families are coming and picking up meals, that they are also able to pick up a small packet of materials to have. So that's just another suggestion as well. I think in no way, shape, or form are we expecting families to all of a sudden have, a preschool or a full early education center in their house, but helping families think through creatively is something we would recommend.
Great. Siobhan asked, what are some ways that we might be able to score E and F? So these are our building relationships on COR. And so as I'm kind of looking through my scoring guide, your scoring guide will actually be key. So having this accessible so that you can really think about those levels, right? So there are some of these levels that we might actually be able to see through a virtual interaction. For example, level 4 of building relationships with adults is, can a child engage in a conversation with an adult taking 2 or more turns? So there are some pieces that we're going to see. However, there's others that might be more specific to playing collaboratively or showing a preference for friends. And in those instances, we're going to have to rely more specifically on our families to be able to gather or give us some of that information. So it might just be during some one-on-one conversations. I definitely recommend, if you have the ability, to plan in some of that time where it's just you and that one family having some time to connect, because then you'll be able to get into some of these kind of more personal questions specifically about a child's development, and then also thinking about what does that particular family need to help individualize learning and what's happening with them right now.
Awesome. Another question, we've seen a couple of people asking questions about the storyboard feature. So I'm going to go ahead and we won't go into it in full depth today. And again, there are tons of resources about storyboards on the help page, so I encourage you to check that out. But one thing that I did want to just show is that storyboards can be a great way as you're thinking about building your classroom community virtually. So this is just a sample of something that we saw kind of come out of the system this spring, where we had a teacher that had collected documentation from different children with what they were doing in their different quote unquote classrooms when they were home, and they just put this together in a simple storyboard just to show, these are the different places where we're learning. So you can think about this as a way to again, continue to build connections between your children, between your families. So just another option that you have here as well.
Great. Someone asked, what ideas do you have for activities to do with preschoolers, perhaps when you're in some of those live Zoom meetings? So we actually recorded a video a couple weeks back about supporting families. It was a webinar a few weeks back. You can go ahead and pull that one back out. It's at highscope.org/webinar. But really, as we are thinking about here at HighScope, which part of our daily routines makes sense live virtually, we really think about 3 parts of our daily routine. So small group time is definitely something you could do live virtually. Of course, in that you will need some preparation of making sure families either have materials, you've either dropped them off, or they've driven through your drive-through at school to be able to pick those up. Somehow you've gotten materials to families, or you're thinking about what materials are in families' homes. The kitchen is a great place to think about the types of materials that families might have. So small group time is one that works live virtually. Large group time could also work live virtually as we're thinking about music and movement and child choice. And then the third one is that interactive read aloud. Those are really the 3 components of the HighScope daily routine that really lend themselves to virtual learning. And then beyond that, it will be a lot of kind of talking with parents, perhaps some individual interactions with children where you're modeling some of those like planning and recall strategies. Just doing that kind of once or twice to be able to model and talk parents through some of those components. We know also that sometimes parents will be very engaged with us, right? And will be right alongside and part of the call. And other times parents might be working. So figuring out who's on the call with you at what points in times, if you can kind of balance. I know that this family is really unable to engage with us throughout the day because they have other things that are also happening. But I know I have this other family where parents really highly engaged. And if we could put perhaps those two families together on a call together, then you're able to balance some of those pieces out as well.
Definitely. Great suggestions. There's tons more questions coming in. So again, we're going to start wrapping up. There's a few other announcements that we want to make sure that we make. So again, you heard Holly talking about the specific last webinar that they did. And I would encourage everyone to check that out if you haven't yet. In addition to that, we do have an upcoming webinar. I mentioned it earlier, but this is going to be next week. And this one's really going to be focused on building relationships with children and families from a distance. So especially for those of you that are starting the school year off virtually, we know that those partnerships are so important. So this is going to provide strategies for, how can you go about that? And again, you can register for that directly at highscope.org/webinar, and you'll be able to find that there. In addition, just to close out today, you will be getting a certificate of this attendance that will be coming 24 hours after the conclusion of this. And in addition to that, you will also be able to access the recording of the event as well. So I want to thank everyone so much for joining us, especially during this busy time. We really appreciate you being here. If you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to us. You can reach out to our help team directly for COR Advantage questions at help@coradvantage.com, and we're happy to help you and partner with you throughout this, throughout the start of the year, but throughout the year and beyond as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, everyone, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.